I just want to introduce Michael Cox. Michael's a collaborator of mine and an assistant professor at Dartmouth College in the Environmental Studies Department. He has a PhD from Indiana University at Bloomington, where he studied at a policy school. And Michael studies community-based natural resource management and ecological and sort of environmental governance and the determinants of resilience and vulnerability in social ecological systems. He's done field work-based research in Peru and Kenya and the Southwest, and is as well, and those were irrigation systems and small-scale fisheries in the Dominican Republic, and now biomass digesters in Vermont and New York are on the plate. The thing that I'm most excited about in Michael's work is an ambitious and kind of unique project that you'll hear about today, in which he's aiming to do some synthesis across a lot of the research that's been done in environmental governance. And I'm excited about it, and you'll hear some about that today. So please help me welcome Michael Cox.
Hi, everyone. All right, so, yeah, that's really bright. I'm going to talk to you guys about two separate projects that I've been involved in. One is more or less finishing up, and the other one's very much ongoing. And the one that's ongoing is the synthesis project that I'm particularly interested in getting people's thoughts and feedback on. So for that, I'm really going to kind of be letting you under the hood to see all the dirty how the research sausage gets made. But to kind of motivate that second project and to also give you an idea of what I actually spend most of my time on, I call myself an environmental social scientist, kind of for lack of a better word, although I'm getting attached to it the more I call myself it. I do fieldwork-based work in community-based natural resource management contexts. My work has gotten kind of increasingly more quantitative. I do semi-structured interviews with resource users, generally do some kind of statistical analysis to see how well they are or are not resolving collective action problems, and thereby affecting the quality and condition of the resource on which they depend. So for my dissertation work and for the first 5 years of my career, I was focused exclusively on irrigation systems. A year or two ago, I had the opportunity to branch out a little bit and look at some fisheries in the Dominican Republic. And I had not done that before, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to not be in a desert during my field work? It turns out that the Northwest Dominican Republic is actually still quite dry. So I was at a desert next to a lot of salt water for this work. So I kind of frequently like to take a step back and think about how my work relates to a kind of idealized narrative of science, and kind of ask myself, how well is my work actually meeting that idealized narrative? Or how well is it not meeting that? And so I thought I would just spend 30 seconds, and it's going to be more than that, but going over what I think that a reasonable idealized narrative of environmental social science is, and maybe science in general, and I would say it's somewhat uncontroversial to say that a lot of what environmental social science is about theorizing. It's about coming up with theories that make predictions about how humans will relate to their natural environment under different conditions. Right? And one thing that we do with theories is that we construct hypotheses from them. And by hypothesis, I basically mean a kind of observational implication of a theory. Right? What would we expect to find in the world if our theory was true? Some people call that deduction. So what do we do then? We test our hypotheses with some data collection. We get the data, right? Still, if I think fairly uncontroversial. We do some analysis, and then we do some inference, or you might call this induction, and then we go back to theory building. And so the hypothetical deductive model of science proceeds to give us truth, right? Fine. And frequently, right, the data in environmental social science is very much based on a particular system. A lot of the work depends on going to a particular place in the world and collecting your data about that place. So it's very much, at least as far as I practice it, and a lot of my colleagues do, a place-based discipline. So that's what I think we'd like to do. That's what I'd like to do, at least a lot of the time. And one of the motivations for the second project I'm going to talk about today is a perceived challenge or inability to entirely satisfy this narrative, to really do everything I think this narrative is telling us that we want to do. The basic framework for my work and a lot of people like the work of a lot of people like me is essentially we're trying to explain environmental outcomes. We do that by ultimately trying to explain human behavior that we assume or measure as affecting environmental outcomes. And in general, we think human behavior is affected by, say, institutions, rules, norms, what some people might call culture, group attributes. This is, very standard categories from what would be called the work on the commons. Biophysical attributes and say, increasingly technology, right? Whether, if farmers get new electrical wells, that will certainly change their behavior. Or if you get a new gear in a fishing community, that will change your behavior toward the commons. So I'm going to spend 10-15 minutes now talking about this work in the Dominican Republic that I've been a part of, and then segue to the more synthetic work. It's in the northwestern part of the Dominican Republic, near Haiti, and it's a small town called Buen Hombre. And it's a very kind of stereotypical common pool resource management setting. It's a community of 800 people. There's about 90 fishermen. So it's small. It's relatively self-contained. Although the Dominicans were frequently complaining about Haitians coming in and catching their fish. Although I imagine if we talk to the Haitians, they complain about the Dominicans coming in and catching their fish. And what led to this project was a PhD student doing some ecological work on the coral reef system. So you essentially have a coral reef ecosystem with different areas of the reef where most of the fishing is taking place. And he was finding signs of ecological degradation, particularly when he compared different properties of certain types of, say, parrotfish, which are ecologically important in these areas, with other areas that are known to be more pristine. So that kind of gave us the outcome that we want to try to explain. And for me, of course, if I'm trying to explain an ecological outcome, I try to understand how human behavior is leading to that outcome. So that led us to try to explain why maybe some fishermen in Buen Hombre are fishing more than others. So we conducted some semi-structured interviews with some questionnaires with about 72 out of the 90 fishermen. We were basically trying to go for a census. Couldn't get everyone. My research assistant actually did the interviews, and I sat in on about 20 of them. We measured certain variables to ultimately do this is a fairly run-of-the-mill analysis, a statistical analysis trying to explain a catch variable with other independent variables we thought would matter. So these are the variables that I'm going to at least talk to you about today. Catch, which was an estimate of just pounds per week, how much they were catching per week. We've got mostly binary variables, native, whether they're from Buen Hombre or not. A lot of these variables are not surprising from folks who thought about commons and common pool resources. Experience, how long they've been a fisherman, whether or not they're a member of this local fishermen's association, which is kind of the main. If you would think that things were going to get better here because they have been declining, you would predict that it would be because there's this association with a lot more social capital than exists in the rest of the community. So a lot of people think this association is how things are going to get better if they do get better. So the prediction there was that, well, we would think that fishermen will be catching less because they'll be kind of mitigating their efforts and their stress on the system. Then we had a couple gear variables because there's a lot of different types of gear that the fishermen use. The main ones that we ended up including in the model that I'm going to show you are essentially whether they're a free diver or a compressor diver. So for a long time, folks in this community for a long time, folks in these communities just were free divers. So they have these spear guns and they hold their breath and they go down. It's really impressive to watch, even if you don't try it, which I never tried it. And they try to shoot a fish, and if they don't shoot it, they've got to go back up, and then they're going to go back down, and they do it for 6 hours, and it's pretty grueling. They do sometimes take the whole next day off. But but it's not, from one perspective, it's not the most efficient way to catch fish. And potentially partly for that reason, but partly I think, as I'll say later, for other reasons, about 20 years ago, new compressor technologies were introduced to the system, essentially air compressors that would stay on the boat and ultimately enable the fishermen to breathe that air via tube and stay down longer, right? So from a single fisherman's perspective, that's potentially very beneficial. They can catch a lot more fish more efficiently. We didn't measure catch per unit effort, but you would think that it would go up. So we had an hypothesis that compressor divers would tend to catch more, all else equal, and free divers would tend to catch less, because there was also a whole bunch of other range of gears, even though we thought these two were the most important. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped dependence, another binary variable, whether or not they indicated they were highly or just minimally dependent on the on fishing. And again, these are fairly standard kind of CPR-esque variables. So I'm not going to belabor these results too much. We did find that compressing and free diving were both fairly significant, particularly given the how much statistical power we had with only an N of 55. Compressor was highly, and if you look at the magnitude of the coefficients, they are practically significant as well. It's hard for you to judge that because I didn't show you the descriptive statistics for like what catches, etc. But you can just trust me that these are significant changes given the scale of the dependent variable. Dependence also seems to matter. Native kind of does, but not as much. So gear, one of the stories we're getting here initially is that gear really matters, and it matters the most. One interesting part of the analysis that I won't show you is that even though membership here, no statistician would say that membership matters here, but one thing we found, going into this analysis, we were predicting that membership would matter, and actually part of the reason we thought it did is because we knew that the members of the Fishermen's Association agreed that they wouldn't use compressor divers. They wouldn't be compressor divers. So so for that reason alone, we thought they would catch less. Well, what's happening here is that, if you compare the association members with non-members, the average pounds per week they catch is much less. But what's happening here is that all of that explaining is getting just swamped up by the gear variables. So what's ultimately happening is our interpretation was that membership matters, but it's an indirect effect on the dependent variable. It's mediated by the gear variables, which is how we interpreted that. So we do think membership matters a lot, just not directly. Native is actually a little similar in that most of the natives are free divers. So we also think that this model actually underemphasizes nativity as well. Couple other things we did. I went nuts with a little social network analysis because I wanted to do some social network analysis for a long time, and I finally found a system where it was possible and I could actually maybe do some interesting science with it. We essentially asked these fishermen in the questionnaires to list the 5 fishermen they fished with the most, a kind of standard recall way of forming a social network. And we did this in part because I wanted to kind of further tell the story of what was going on in the fishery. And one of the things you see in this graph is that this graph helps further impact the role that gear plays in the fishery. So you can see that this is a social network, the nodes of which are individual fishermen. The connections are co-fishing behavior. There's a link between 2 different nodes if a fisherman said, I fished with this other person. And so what you see, kind of unsurprisingly, is that they group. Or they cluster, or it's modular. Right? And that's not terribly surprising. And if you were there for even a couple weeks, you kind of knew that as well, right? What's kind of additionally interesting is that they cluster strongly by the gear they use, right? So these blue ones are the free divers. And in fact, I'm not going to show you color-coded by association membership. These are the association members, most of them. So you can see again that some people do social network analysis, they can interpret strength of density of connections as social capital, which confirms our thought going in that the association members would have the most social capital. And they seem to kind of in this way too. You have a secondary set of free divers here. And the red are the compressor divers. And these other guys, the green, are what are called yoleros, which are essentially the folks that need to stay on the boat and manage the air compressors. So the Christmas group, I mean, that's expected, right? Something would have been wrong if the compressors didn't have yoleros with them. So that's what's essentially going on there. And you see, right, that there's not a lot of connectivity between these groups, right? And that, we haven't published this stuff, so we're still kind of sorting out exactly what we think of all of this. But it seems from a kind of collective action standpoint, and of course there are other, this is one main component, and then there's other kind of, these guys are just kind of completely all out on their own with nets or other things. Yes?
The empty symbols,
the
non-colored ones.
They are folks that we didn't actually interview, but were referred to by someone we did interview. So from a collective action perspective, right, we've identified that these are the folks that are probably exerting more pressure on the reef. And there's not a lot of social connectivity, at least in the way we measured it, because of course there's other ways you can measure it. But in the way we measure it, there's not a lot of connectivity between the folks with a lot more social capital who have agreed to do less with the folks that haven't and agreed to do more. And there are some leaders in the community, and this is actually the leader of the association, he's the president, that happens to be him. But you'll notice that he actually doesn't have a lot of connections to these other folks either. Right? So leadership is a very important variable in our CPR work, but it looks like that leader has not positioned himself well to necessarily have a lot of influence on the behavior of these other folks, which we think these are the folks whose behavior you kind of need to change more. And finally, we did a little bit of GIS work. We essentially asked the fishermen to mark on a map where they fish now and where they used to fish. So somewhat informal, but we wanted to visualize just to see what happened. And what you essentially see is that these darker ones, the red and the purple, are all free diving locations. All right, and I'm horrible. My chromatic vocabulary stinks. I'm going to call this aquamarine, and that's actually not so bad. And yellow, right? Those are much farther out on average, and they don't tend to cluster in the same places along the reefs where it's going to be shallower and you can hold your breath for longer. So this is in fact another role that gear is playing. Gear is playing several roles in this system, right? It's enabling folks to catch more, and it's in fact playing them kind of interdependently. One of the ways it's helping them catch more, we think, is that it's allowing them to fish farther out in places that maybe hadn't been fished so much previously, right? And this will also, if you're fishing way over here, it makes sense that you're not fishing with this person, right? So these results all tend to kind of confirm each other to tell a particular story about how gear is working in this system. So that was one of our strongest findings from this work. And we're writing up the discussion of this paper now. And one of the questions I've been asking myself, and I ask myself it more and more when I do kind of more case-based or place-based work, is how does this fit back into this idealized narrative of how we're doing science? Right? So I kind of had some theories going into this. I had some theoretical expectations. I did some deduction and had some expectations about what I would find. I also spent some time there, and so there was some induction involved to kind of come up with what else we would measure and find. But what theory did I confirm here? I'm actually not sure initially. Right, so increasingly I have felt that one of the real challenges that a lot of folks studying the commons, environmental social science face is less doing this kind of stuff. This stuff's challenging, and this is a fairly basic analysis compared to some of the really good stuff that's out there. We want to combine different methods. GIS is fantastic. Social network stuff is really neat. It's hard to get all the data. But I think the bottleneck is less the kind of standard normal science and more integrating the different projects and site-specific results. Right? And I think we want to do that because a part of our idea of science is this idea that we want it to be cumulative. And part of what it means to be cumulative is that we have this increasing body of coherent theories, right? And we have them somewhere, right? But I'm not sure where we have them, and I'm not sure, right, what theory I confirmed here exactly. So these are some questions I've been asking myself, and I think these are challenges to kind of normal environmental social science the way a lot of us do it. I'm sitting in on a class of biology professors teaching on the philosophy of science, which I'm loving. And last week he assigned an article from Science from like 1963 called "Chaos in the Brickyard." Does this work? Yeah. And I can never remember the author's name, but if you Google "Science, Chaos in the Brickyard," you'll find this. And the author's point, however many years ago now, was it's essentially this analogy of science being similar to building a house, right? And what do you need to build a house? You need bricks, right? And his concern was that we've now got a whole bunch of people making really good bricks, right? And we've got lots of venues for those bricks, right? But there's fewer and fewer people worried about putting the bricks together to build a house, right? So it's fairly straightforward. So the concern is, okay, we've gotten really, really good at building bricks. How and when do we need to sit back and think about how those bricks fit together? If the goal of environmental social science is to accumulate something we call a body of theory, how do we accumulate that? Right? Okay, so even if I found a theory that my work confirmed, what do I do with that? Am I done as a scientist? I say, confirm this theory. Am I also supposed to say that this theory now has more support than these other ones and contribute to a conversation about should theories compete with each other? Maybe, right? But a lot of us don't spend an awful lot of time thinking about that. How do I know which theories to test in a given study? Which concepts to use in a given study? How might I diagnose a system? So my former advisor, who was the inspiration actually for just about all of us directly or indirectly, which used to talk a lot about diagnosis and the need to kind of diagnose a system somewhat efficiently. And whenever she said that, I always took it to mean, what are the first questions that we ask? And how do we systematically decide what follow-up questions we will ask based on the answers to the first one? That's what I think diagnosis is. Well, how do we do that? One way we could do it is if we had a nice body of theory sitting around that said, these are the predictions you would have for this type of system, right? That would be what maybe Orrin Young or other folks have called mid-range theory, right? Theories that are about certain types of somewhat generalized conditions, right? Finally, do we have a sufficient common understanding of our important concepts or our important theories? Right, so in addition to theories, I think a lot of the challenge is that the measurement protocols that a lot of us use in our field sites end up being fairly idiosyncratic to those field sites. Which there's nothing wrong with that per se, and it's difficult to get away from that. But a lot of our concepts in social science they're not like pH, right? Level of dependence on a natural resource could be measured in many, many different ways. And that's fine as long as that diversity doesn't extend to those ways being so different that they would actually affect our conclusions about the role that variable plays in natural resource management. That's a bad situation, particularly if we're not aware of it. And then I argue with Tim for an hour about natural resource dependence, when really we should have been, hugging each other or something. For an hour, right? Yeah. Okay, so that brings me to this other project that's been going on for about 5 years. 5 years. And it's called SESMAD. And if you really want to know, it stands for Social-Ecological Systems Meta-Analysis Database. We had been meeting in New Hampshire for about 3.5 days straight when someone came up with that name. So the idea behind this project, it was initially motivated by Lynn Ostrom's work in 2007 in which he published this, essentially a paper on diagnosing complex sociological systems. She introduced a framework to do this, and I have argued before that if you followed Lynn and other folks' work really closely, actually most of what's in the framework has been shown before. So it was really a synthesis of stuff that she and other folks she worked with had already said. And I really liked a lot of the language that Lynn used to describe this framework. She talked about it as a meta-theoretical language that we could use to kind of make our verbal interactions more consistent, so that Tim and I don't argue about resource dependence, right? She also talked about diagnosis and generally coming up with more of a standard or a protocol for how maybe social-ecological case studies could be done. So I really like that. I really like those ideas. And so about 5 years ago, at a kind of sub-meeting of the Resilience Alliance meeting in Arizona, a bunch of us got together and said, why don't we try to move forward with this SES framework thing and see what we can do? I guess I could mention that one project I did that kind of further motivated this work was essentially I did a meta-analysis of all of the papers that had cited Lynn's initial 2 papers in which she introduced the framework. She introduced it in 2007, 2009 in close to identical ways. And so there were as of a year ago, there were 700 plus papers that had cited these 2. And it was basically trying to evaluate how effective a framework was, which feels like a kind of strange scientific enterprise, because usually it's theories that you're supposedly trying to evaluate. So what we evaluated was the extent to which the framework had enabled the consistent analysis of particular social ecological systems. If it had done that, the more it did that, the better. We weren't going to come up with some arbitrary number, right? But what we found is that of the 700 plus papers, only about 30 of them used it empirically. And this paper's under review. It's a challenge. And of those 30, only 5 used a consistent protocol, and those 5 were SESMAD cases. So, it seems clear that, and the challenge that the framework is facing, and the fact that it hasn't yet quite met it, is, to me, it wasn't like an indictment of the framework. It's a challenge that basically the literature faces generally, right? There aren't a lot of case studies in the literature generally that use a common protocol, regardless of whether they're referring to the SES framework or not, to my knowledge. So we wanted to try to move forward with it. A bunch of us have been involved in several projects at Indiana. Most significantly is this one called IFRI, International Forestry Resources and Institutions work. And that was actually, along with this SES framework, is the basis for this project. IFRI is a really fantastic fieldwork-based research program that has really kind of set the bar for actually doing consistent fieldwork-based environmental social science. And it has this complex relational database that it stores the data in, and it's really pretty good. So we developed a relational database as a kind of further development of the SES framework, and we tried to develop some protocols for how the SES framework could be used. Oh no, I don't want to go there yet. So I'm going to spend, what I have, about 10 minutes left. What I want to basically do is, I'm going to go to, we have a website now. Because ultimately what we were able to do once I got to Dartmouth was to put this online, and with the help of some IT folks there, take it from Microsoft Access, which I actually think is really nice, even though it's Microsoft, and put it into a website with basically an Oracle backend and a website front end to actually do a lot of stuff that I couldn't do on my own. So the website now has essentially what are called business logic rules that can guide the user in data entry. So what we essentially have is a relational database that actually has a table for the variables themselves so that users can add the variables that they think matter for their own case if they want. You can say that this variable only matters for forest cases, or you can say it only matters for fishery cases. And if someone comes along in your project and says, my case is a fishery case, the database will only ask you about that question if it's also a fishery case or if it's just relevant for any case. So that was trying to get at the sea of diagnosis that Lynn had kind of promoted, right? Asking certain questions but not others depending on the details of the case. So let me just show you it now. Here it is, Dartmouth SESMAD. A talented Dartmouth undergrad did this and these watercolors, which I'm very happy with. So I just want to show you two things. There's more that we're trying to do that I'm going to show you here. But I'm going to show you talking about variables and theories. So we have this variables page. And what essentially the variables page has is a list of all of the variables that our group thought would be potentially relevant to any social ecological analysis. Here we go. So this is the introduction to the page. This tells you how we basically describe each variable based on theme, based on the question that prompts the user to answer that question. This is publicly available, so you can go here on your own time. And then we basically have a table of all of the variables that a group of 14 kind of young environmental social scientists could think of that could be relevant. Black market scale, boundary clarity, boundary fuzziness, like a lot of these would be unsurprising to a lot of you. Vulnerability, how vulnerable is the actor based on some of that literature, how much knowledge. And the variables are also specific to different types of components, which is, I don't want to lose people who haven't thought a lot about the SES framework before, right? But the SES framework basically says a social ecological system is made of components. And this goes back to, this is old workshop-y stuff, really. There are actor groups of some sort. There are commons, you call them natural resource units or systems, I don't care, commons, and governance systems. And so each of the variables in our database belongs to one of those things. Which makes sense because you don't ask the same questions about a commons that you do about a governance system. Right, and so what we then do actually is when you add a variable, so if I wanted to, I could just add one. And what it'll ask you is you need to name it. You can make it specific to the project. So we've got, if some of the folks that are working on fisheries in Fiji, they can just do their own thing. Question, what the definition is, theoretical importance. And then component type, you can say it's any actors, it's a local government actor. And again, if you said it was only for, say, pollutants, then this variable, so like toxicity, right, could be a variable that's appropriate for pollutants, right? The database won't ask you about the toxicity of a natural resource unit if you add it later on. That's the idea. Similar for sector, which you see right here. So sectors are what we normally think of, right? So forests, air pollution, irrigation, and these can actually be added by later users, such as Stacy, who is testing out something, right? And so the idea here again is the same, is that you can add stuff that's useful for some folks, but doesn't kind of become onerous for other people. I won't go too much more into the variables. They're publicly viewable. So the final thing I want to talk about today is actually these theories, which has actually become the thing I'm almost most excited about with this work. So we have a list of theories. Theories are an object in the database. They have their own table, which is a relational database. It's just a database made of different tables. So it actually turned, we have lots of theories in work on the commons in environmental social science. So what our group is trying to do is not to, I'm not trying to come up with Michael Cox's theory. Well, maybe someday, right? But what we're essentially trying to do here is formalize, not mathematically formalize, which is what a lot of people mean by that term, but essentially come up with a protocol for consistently expressing the theoretical statements we think are important, that you want to test or further develop. So that when I did that Dominican Republic work, I could say I tested this theory, and this is what I think of it, right? So some of our theories had names, like the tragedy commons, right? That's a theory that has a name. Another one that I've mentioned to like half of the people I talk to today is roving banditry. That is a theory that has a name, right? You could argue that, from the resilience folks, the pathology of natural resource management, command and control kind of stuff, that's a theory, right? So for some of the theories, it was fairly easy. There's you just take the title of an article, and that's your theory, right? For some of them, it's more difficult. But essentially what we wanted to do is to further enable a more explicit implementation of that kind of idealized narrative of how science gets done by actually having like a repository of theories. The database also is designed to actually consistently code social-ecological cases, but that's kind of a different thing. So I was struggling a little bit with like what theory was I dealing with in the Dominican case, and I should let you know also that you're like very much being let under the hood with this. So this is publicly available, but it's only going to be publicly available for like a week because we didn't mean for it to be entirely publicly available. So what's going to happen soon is that I'm going to get a little approved button, and I'm going to hit no on most of these. So if you go in here, feel free to go in here. There's just going to be a lot of variation in how complete the different ones are. So go nuts if you want. What I'm playing around with now in the Dominican case is it seemed like what the role of technology was, it seemed like it partially enabled the fishermen to kind of punt on the urgency of their resource depletion issue. That 20 years ago, this is almost an hypothesis with respect to this particular case. One thing that the compressors did was it enabled them to fish farther out, right? Maybe ameliorated the extent to which they were really taking a lot of fish from right next to the beach, which in a way is a good thing. But it also enabled them to maybe not impose more fundamental behavioral changes on themselves that they might have had to, or else face economic collapse earlier than they have. And this is something, there's dozens of papers that talks about some dynamic like this. And I'd seen it in my own field work in other places. In my time in Colorado, I've worked with some farmers, and they did something similar, where in 1950 there was a big drought. This is in the San Luis Valley of Colorado. And what do they do in response to the drought in terms of surface water? They dig wells, right? Because electricity is getting cheaper and they've got this new technology. So instead of the collective response, they can have essentially individual level responses that enable them to somewhat punt on, again, the issue of collective behavioral change. And that's not a bad thing per se. I mean, from their perspective, they have access to 2 resources instead of 1, and so maybe they think their adaptability has gone up. And maybe the Buen Hombre fishermen feel the same way, right? But it does seem like it's problematic and might make them more vulnerable to continued or larger disturbances or changes in the long run when they can't just, right, what do they do once the groundwater runs out? Which it is running out. There's this terrifying looking hydrograph of the groundwater. Right, what do they do then, right? And as I said, many people have talked about this dynamic, but I couldn't think of a name for it. So what I called it was something I heard from a fellow a long time ago when he was talking about system archetypes. I don't know if that's related to system dynamics, but it essentially is causal loop diagrams that people think about. And there's these set of archetypes of those, and one's called shifting the burden, which I really like in a way, even though it's usually not seen as desirable. So for now, we've got a theory in SESMAD. That's not shift, sorry. Shifting the burden. So I can click on it. And here's kind of the approach we're taking. There's initially a variable relationship field, which again, you could read this on your own time if you want, that basically tries to summarize this kind of mechanistic narrative that was part of my definition of the theory earlier. This is where that goes. It basically says, this is what we think is happening. So all of these are in draft form in the database right now. But then what we want to do, and I know I'm not giving you enough time to read all this. These are all variables that were previously entered in the database. So you can't add a variable to a theory unless it's already in there. And this is kind of the power of relational databases, that you can do this kind of stuff. So, and each time a variable is added, the database asks you, well, what role is this variable playing? Explain that role. And do you want to assign a value from the range of possible values? Do you need to talk about the values of the variables to help you tell your story and make the prediction this theory would make? So, I added technological role, causal level, blah, blah, blah. And it goes from, you can have underlying independent variables, proximate independent variables, intermediate, final outcomes. You can also have moderating variables if you think that there's some kind of interaction effect going on. We were trying to basically find a balance between allowing some consistent vocabulary in the expression of theories and not having the rules to be too fixed. So what's the story? Well, technology enables users to either access an additional resource or mitigate the effects of a harmful pollutant, thereby avoiding the problems that resulted from their excessive use of a portion of the commons. And ultimately what that leads to is increased actor vulnerability in the long run is the concern, partially because it lowers the visibility of the use of that commons. So someone else could do their own work and say, well, I'm going to use I'm not sure that we're ultimately going to call this shifting the burden. But this is a theory that I'm going to use, and I'm going to test for whether technology is playing this role in this system. Because we have other theories in the database that predict a different role for technology. Right? Of course, because it's not always going to do this. And I think that's one of the interesting things about this exercise, is that it sensitizes you to the very different roles that the same variable can play depending on, right, the other variables it's kind of playing with. And so we all talk about, like, oh, context matters, right? And this has been one way for us to kind of tease out maybe how context does matter. The final thing I'll mention, and the thing I'm almost most excited about, is we now have, the user can actually relate theories to each other to actually try to implement this idea of there being like a body of theory. Because different theories can have relationships with each other. Someone asked me, I forget who, can't you have two theories that are really the same thing and just depend, this person over here called it their thing and this person there called it their thing. Well, I mean, yeah, right. So what you can actually do is, if you want, you can add both of those theories and you can say that they're similar to each other. That's similar to the kind of relationship that our theories can have with each other. And at the bottom of a theories page, it'll say relationship similar, if that's what this was. There's a couple other types of relationships I don't need to go into now. One of them is a theory is actually nested within another theory. And this is exploratory, but a consistent pattern seems to be that this dynamic of shifting the burden is contained within the critique of centralized control a lot. So when people critique the kind of command and control centralized governance problem, this dynamic plays a large role in that. So in Holling and Meffy and Jim Scott and a lot of those folks have criticized this process of technology enabling a centralized system to kind of punt on issues is pretty consistent in that literature. Why we didn't just fold this into the theory called the failure of centralized control is because it doesn't always happen in centralized systems. In fact, the two that I've seen it in are fairly decentralized. So I didn't want to lump it into the same theory. And that's what we've been dealing with a lot, is like, what makes the cut for a theory? And I had never asked that before doing this. So I can actually click on this failure of centralized control theory. And here we go. And don't be surprised, there's a lot of easy studies to find that talk about this, right? Including Jim Atchison talked about it. Jim Scott, Holling, Berkey's, recently, Felling, William Easterly talked about it in the context of development in the environment. One of my John McPhee has a chapter about it in the Achafalaya chapter of Control of Nature, which is an awesome read. He talks about the levees and the basic, yeah. So the idea here is that there's this other theory about the failure of centralized control that talks about, starts with centralization as the underlying independent variable. You have low metric diversity. Centralized systems tend to only emphasize one aspect of a system that they want to manage. this is a very some of this comes most directly from Jim Scott's work. Low institutional diversity. You then have low ecological fit. It says no because the question is essentially, is there ecological fit? And then common condition trend, which is our main dependent variable here, is worsened. And these unpack each step as they go about why this works the way it does. So that's most of it, guys. And there's other theories. We've got some that's been inspired from folks here. We've got parametric management as a theory in here. I want to show it because I'd be shy to see if I've done it right. But essentially, we're trying to just have a repository of the different, for this part of the project, the different theoretical statements that we think are important based on, some rules, but not too stringent rules for now, because again, this is fairly exploratory. In the future, we might even allow users to create models out of these, but that's a different thing. The last thing we'll do actually is there's going to be a button that you can hit that will render all the theories and their relationships with each other. We'll basically have a network diagram of all our theories and their relationships with each other. And that's when I'll actually start trying to write something about it. Well, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So I feel like part of the problem, I'm interested in how you talk about what you're trying to do with SESMAD. So, because it seems to me that within a given traditional natural resource discipline, fisheries, forestry, agriculture, that the problems that they have overcome the sort of meta-scientific problem of knowing what to measure, knowing what the theories are, knowing what they predict, and what the relevant results have been, right, to a certain extent. And
so this is like forestry, or
for instance.
Okay.
That's a simplification, but the point is that within a discipline there is a well-accepted set of terminology, theories, sort of expectations, epistemological beliefs.
Okay.
Right, and so, but of course, in environmental social science in general, sustainability science, what have you, it's an interdisciplinary world in a sort of Wild West kind of way, right? Where we have people have different epistemology, people have different ontologies. And so, is SESMAD trying to
settle the Wild West or something?
Well, help us. Frankly, that would be wonderful because we need it's people are with 6 guns out there right now, and it's
I need a new watercolor
for me. But yeah, but I guess I'm wondering, is this an attempt to help us do that, to overcome, to build a way that we can improve the way we talk about the systems we study across these disciplines in this Wild West, or is it something?
I like that one, what you just said.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think a lot of it.
Or is it something new? Is it something else?
Well, it's kind of the way I think about it a lot of the time. I mean, improving the way and the rigor with which we talk about our predictions and the patterns in our systems in ways that have more kind of explicit reference, right? Because I would actually sometimes argue that a lot of the time we talk as if we had something like this already. We make verbal statements, verbal theories in natural language about what we would expect based on resource dependence or something else, right? High active mobility, millions of things, right? Sometimes, at least I think I do this. I act as if this has already been done well. And in my conversations, I feel like other people sometimes do that too. But I don't think we have done it well yet. And that makes me a little nervous sometimes because we need to use natural language. But I think sometimes we want to think more carefully about having more of an explicit framework for that. So that when I say tragedy, even tragedy commons sometimes, like the theory of all theories, some would say, it was not trivial for us to enter that in the database. Right? Is there property rights involved? Well, Hardin actually mentions there's some kind of like a property rights. Does Hardin, how does it relate to centralized control? Because lots of people say that Hardin advocated for centralized control, but I just reread Hardin for the 5th time, and for the 5th time I found no mention of advocating for centralized control. So a lot of it is just trying to clarify things. Yeah. Yeah.
So is there a way to sort of test some of these ideas by putting into the system something where you already know the outcome and see if this works it through? And I guess I'm thinking of this. I know it's not a model,
Yeah.
but I'm sort of thinking of it like that, which might be the wrong way to think about it.
Well, I mean, one thing that's tricky about this is that this is not, I wouldn't call this analysis. I mean, the Dominican Republic stuff I did, I showed you some analysis, but this stuff is not, right, I'm not analyzing data, anything here. This is kind of data integration, synthesis stuff. And so there's a lot of unanswered questions even if you do this well. Okay, you have a body of theory. Good for you. What do we do with it now? That's a separate question that this thing doesn't answer, right? Do we do some kind of, the database actually lets you attach studies to theories to say this theory comes from this study. And when you do that, it lets you say this study supports, contradicts, or just talks about this theory. Okay, does that mean we do some kind of vote counting based meta-analysis that kind of tallies up how many different studies support different theories? I mean, that's one type of meta-analysis folks have done. That's one way you could try to start measuring like how much support there is for different theories. I don't know if this is exactly answering your question. But in any case, it's an open question.
One of the things that you would do with this.
That's one of the things we could try to do with it. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of obvious question once you've actually got all the theories together, right? Is like, how do we...
But isn't there like an endless number of theories? I mean...
I hope not.
I don't know.
There's a lot, yeah. I mean, ultimately, there's a dozen of us, and for me, this is my main hobby. For everyone else, it's their hobby when Mike bothers them. You know, so the plan for the next stage of this is we're going to meet for about 5 days in the summer with most of it done, and just, you know, try to hammer it out and get to something where we can say, okay, world, this is not that bad. But yeah, but from there, it's the scientific question of how you know, should theories compete with each other the way that variables do in a regression? You know, that's a kind of almost philosophy of science question about how do you proceed with science? Is it best if you have a kind of market of theories? And, you know, there's not an easy answer to that, I think. Yeah, Jim.
Can I ask a question about the Dominican Republic study?
Mm-hmm.
Your shifting analysis had an implicit historical part of the story.
Right.
It also implied that people shifted, but you clearly identified two separate groups fishing in these different spatial locations. Did shifting really occur there?
So you're talking about the GIS data that showed the comparison of the two different periods spatially?
Was it? We're talking about the red dots close to shore and the yellow dots offshore.
Right.
Two different gear types, two different groups of people by your description.
Right.
But your historical hypothesis was that it was shifting that took place, that the inshore was depleted and then people moved to the offshore.
Well, I mean, it seems like that's the... It seems like nearshore depletion is... I mean, the strongest inferences we can really make with the Dominican work is a set of rival hypotheses, one of which, a strong candidate of which, is that there was nearshore depletion that caused some folks to adopt this technology and move farther offshore. I would imagine a part of the explanation is also simply that fishermen realize that if you start using a compressor, you can fish a lot more regardless of where you fish. So, I mean, I was a little overly simplistic in the initial, like, you know, is this shifting the burden? So really the status at which I would place the Dominican Republic inferences is almost, I think that we have several kind of likely hypotheses that are explaining this behavior, one of which is this kind of shifting the burden behavior. But I wouldn't be confident enough to say that I know that that's the only thing that's going on that explains the outcomes that we're seeing. I don't know if that's answering your question.
guess a question kind of following up on that is, from what I remember of that image that you had, there was not very many rescue divers on the near shore.
Right.
Is there some kind of social agreement that they won't fish on the reef where the free divers are?
Not that I ever saw, and not that my colleagues talked to me about. It seemed to be simply that it was less crowded in terms of fishermen near shore and more crowded in terms of fish. Yeah.
Follow up on that actually. Did you have in your interviews a follow up of if that type of shifting cause some type of conflict, like social conflict, in the community? And does that affect your vulnerability? Like a social vulnerability?
Did we have a question in the questionnaire about whether or not the shifting led to social conflict?
Yeah, I'm just interested in, like, when fishermen change their territories, if you have any conflict on the water then, or not till the end.
We didn't have a question in the questionnaire about it. We definitely kind of observed it in the months that we were there. So, I mean, this gets back to the extent to which the Dominican Republic case really supports the shifting the burden theory. And one of the difficulties there is also the outcome of vulnerability, which is essentially a prediction. And the trickiness about vulnerability in terms of measuring. So we did not have a measurement of vulnerability. It's more or less a prediction of what will happen in the fishery in the future. And the trickiness about vulnerability and adaptive capacity, I was at a meeting that was only about measuring adaptive capacity this last summer, and it was just really hard to actually measure that, because what you ultimately need is longitudinal data that includes some stressors or disturbances, some of which deals with thresholds, etc. And that's been one of the challenges actually in codifying some of these theories in the database, because we do have adaptive capacity and vulnerability as variables in the database. We do not have sustainability. Some people wanted it, and it was just, I didn't, we do have resilience, and it's a big challenge of a lot of that literature. I mean, a lot of the resilience literature, the resilience folks have found it kind of equally devilishly hard to come up with consistent measures of resilience. So, to some extent, in our codifying the theories in the database, I think an accurate summary is that we are actually kind of going maybe beyond the state of the art in the empirical work in what it actually can prove or test. So we might be at the stage for some of the theories of simple, they are hypothetical. And that could be something we could record about the theories, like, has this theory, how well has it been proven, which would go back to the other point, or is it really at the stage where it's just a kind of conjecture?
So maybe one last one.
So I'm coming here from a marine science program, and I've read enough marine or coral reef ecology papers to know that a lot of the reef ecologists out there would kill for the social science information that you got for the system. And a lot of the times they just write overfishing has occurred, and like SES folks would say that's such a gloss. But on the other hand, there's a huge ecological dimension that's missing in this study if you want to talk about human impacts on reef systems.
Sure.
In terms of the amount of variability that you're implying or proposing. So, in my view, a lot of the problem here is literally just closing the loop between the two and enhancing collaboration. So, for your case in particular, how might that loop close itself, and how might your brickyard turn into a house?
A social-ecological house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the extent to which we did integrate it was to use my ecologist PhD student colleagues, basically coral fish survey data as the outcome that we were trying to explain. And that's better than nothing, and a lot of folks do that in environmental social science work. They kind of take the environmental outcome as the thing. So whether it's agricultural output or Landsat-based measurements of forests, and they say, okay, well, this is our dependent variable. And my impression is that most folks have struggled to do a lot more than that. But no, I mean, yes, I agree that it would be great to try to have less hand-waving in reciprocal directions.
But let's not wave our hands in reciprocal directions. But thank you.